Great looking, limit pushing Amiga shoot 'em ups. That's pretty straightforward, I think, a rundown of some of the Amiga's finest shooters, and it had a few. Its exterior may have been an office drab slab, almost too dull to describe, but what emerged from its fundament was thrice blessed with polychromatic wonderment, or something like that. So let's dive into some nice looking games that go bang, starting with, it has to be, Hybris. Right away we're greeted with a lovely arcade-style attract sequence and a rather authentic-looking Hollywood-esque credits roll, obviously too good to leave until the end. But well, would you look at that, a lovingly rendered digital portrait of the game's chief creators, Martin Pedersen and Torben Larsen. More games should do this. It's like shaking hands with the captain when you get on a plane. Very reassuring. With these two hunks of manliness at the helm, how can this game fail to be anything other than fabulous? And yes, that's exactly what it is. When this was released in 1988, the Amiga was just beginning to find its feet, at least in Europe, and the trickle of games was maturing into a flood. Hybris was not the first shooter on the system, but it was amongst the first wave of games that really let the world know what the Amiga could do, the leading edge of the 16-bit gaming revolution. It's not an arcade conversion, but it might as well be, aiming high at recreating the then gaming gold standard found in coin-operated machines. Slightly derivative maybe, comparisons with other well-known games from big names are easy, but that's maybe not such a bad thing. There still weren't that many great shooters on the Amiga, conversions or otherwise, so any well-done riff on this theme was welcome. And Hybris has stood the test of time pretty well, much better than nearly anything else that came out on the system at the same time. It looks superb, it sounds fantastic, and importantly it plays as well as the arcade shooters it was inspired by. Frame rate fans will be pleased to hear that this runs at the full 50 FPS of the PAL machine, an extremely smooth experience made possible by use of the Amiga's hardware sprites. It's got all you need really, a well balanced difficulty curve, an interesting power-up system, some rocking tunes, well thought out enemy placement, a gift wrapped package of scrolling shooty thumb candy. But as good as it was, Hybris could be improved, and Battle Squadron, the sequel released just a year later by the same team, showed exactly how. Battle Squadron does everything that Hybris does, but a bit better. A vivid 2D tableau of old school action. Speedy, yes, but smooth also. Once again, this remains at a rock solid 50 frames per second, but piles on even more stuff to look at and more enemies to wipe out. It's even got simultaneous two-player cooperative play. Add in the elaborate power-up system and a non-linear level structure, and this becomes very much a cutting-edge, state-of-the-art production from the latter part of the 80s. It learned well from its inspirations, but added original ideas too. I don't know if it's intentional or not, but this does bring to mind the works of Compile, and maybe even the Star Force series as well. Hardcore shooter fans will know that this is definitely a good thing, the game having a ring of authenticity that too many home computer shooters lacked. At its best, this doesn't seem like a good arcade conversion, it seems more like an actual arcade game, a genuine shooter masterpiece maybe. Unfortunately for us, the two German youngsters responsible for both these games turned their attention to other things after this, so there's no more to be seen from these two on the Amiga. But of course, there were plenty of others willing to jump in their stead, so let's take a look at another pair of games in a two-part series, starting with Crossout. And yes, it is Crossout, not X-Out, but let's not get bogged down in that. A shooter with a sort of aquatic steampunk theme, once again from Germany, and this time made by Amiga stalwarts Rainbow Arts. A game that appeared on a lot of platforms in the European market, but the Amiga version was unsurprisingly the best, as was so often the case. Euro shmup is a term that comes up quite a lot when talking about this sort of game, and while used derisively as it often is, it's a bit unfair. Many great shooters came from this part of the world. Used descriptively when talking about style, well, it does make a bit more sense, and Crossout ticks many of the Euro shmup boxes. Coming out in 1990, it could almost be the type specimen. Yep, it's a horizontal scroller with an energy bar, a complex power-up system based around a shop mechanic, a lot of elaborate backgrounds and some bullet sponge bosses. It might not pass muster with your serious shooter enthusiasts, but it's really not a bad game at all, the kind of thing that made many people think they made the right choice when they bought the Amiga. Like Hybris though, it was left sort of in the shade by its direct sequel that popped up not long after. Z Out, and yes, it is Z Out and not Zigzag Out, the naming convention of the first one thrown away, or well, maybe it's Z Out, but let's not go down that road. Whatever you want to call it, this game also throws away the Euro stylings of the previous title, becoming a more traditional Gradius R-type style of thing with collectible power-ups and no upgrade shop. What it does have though is some top-end graphics and a pleasing bouncy Europop soundtrack and some nice game design. Yes, there is an awful lot of shooting, dodging and general shmupping, but it goes an extra quirky mile with interesting levels and inventive boss design. In fact, it goes a bit beyond Twitch gaming, requiring some puzzle solving and strategizing to get through it, without straying too far from the blasted point of an arcade endeavour. Precise navigation is the only way you'll prevail in certain sections, bringing to mind Cybernoid on the old Specky at times, a tough challenge to anyone trying to clear this without cheating. And the bosses, well, rather than just shoot the core, a lot of them require a bit of planning before you can even start to do damage, crafty action riddles to be solved, something few games like this have ever attempted. Aesthetically, well, it borrows liberally from stuff we may have seen before, especially the HR Geiger light of the last couple of stages, but it's done with enough flair to let it slide. A very respectable attempt at invoking that futuristic biological horror style, looking nicer than most Amiga games that try the same thing. Have I mentioned the soundtrack? I think I did, but it's worth mentioning again, the work of Chris Hulsbeck, the Amiga maestro par excellence. Like everything he did, it's a winner. Now, moving on from the sci-fi into something that's, well, not more realistic, but at least more earthly, it's Swiv. A pseudo-sequel to Silkworm, the arcade horizontal scroller that buffed up well on the Amiga. I'm not sure if it's in any way official or not, but it's dubbed Silkworm 4 in the manual, despite there being no second and third entry in the series. Now, I've kind of avoided arcade conversions in this rundown, mainly because most of them weren't all that good, but also because it's original games like this that seem to shine the brightest on this old alabaster astonisher. Maybe a bit more meat and potatoes than some games on this list, a military-themed shooter with not many surprises stylistically, but with a few enjoyable gameplay twists. Number 1, there's not actually any levels here, it's all one long continuous fight. I suppose Xevious got there first, but this is something I think that was unique amongst games in this generation. A trick made possible by continually streaming data off the disc as the game goes on. Cleverly done. It also has 2 separate controllable vehicles to choose from, a fairly unsurprising helicopter but also a Jeep too. A throwback to the original game of course, this feature hanging on from the switch from horizontal to vertical. It also allows for simultaneous 2-player action too. Despite not being the most effective way to play the game, the Jeep is really the most fun, as it was in the original. It perhaps calls to mind the Konami game Jackal. I do wonder if that was an influence. But well, let's leave this one here. There's more to cover, and how could I possibly make a video about Amiga shooters without mentioning this next beastie, one of the Amiga's finest forays in this field? It's Apidya. A game that goes a long way to ape the Eastern games that defined this genre, even featuring Japanese on the title screen. But ignore that, it's from, surprise surprise, Germany once more. Also ignore the Roman numerals, it's not a sequel either. It does though have a lengthy anime-style opening cinematic. A classic tale of boy meets girl, girl gets poisoned by evil wizard, boy turns into wasp to seek revenge. Yes, it all makes perfect sense and is almost mad enough to be actual Japanese game lore, but sadly the haircuts are not quite ludicrous enough to be convincing. The game itself though, well, think Konami and you won't be far out. A very sumptuously presented button masher that does interesting things with the setting, but plays by the book mostly when it comes to game mechanics. Starting off in the weeds and wildflowers, the game begins in the Apian natural world, probably unique in this genre, and it does make a nice change. After that, it's time to lay waste to a load of angry fish, their minds in the control of the aforementioned evil wizard, who really needs to think hard about what he does with his spare time. Then a quick trip through the sewers, the home of a load of fearsome hornets and a very dead rat. Then it gets weird. Okay, weirder. A transformation into some sort of techno-wasp takes place and we're transported out of the natural world into science fiction, the rest of the game having a sort of insect cyberpunk mood. Maybe slightly more familiar ground for shooter fans, but not that much. There's a lot more fish than your average blaster. For some, this is the best shooter on the Amiga, and well, it's certainly got to be in the running. Not flawless, but still darn fine. It is brutally difficult. Well, these games are, of course, but it does seem to be a touch crueler than it needs to be, ramping up the challenge quite a lot. High performance, great visuals, a thumping soundtrack. If arcadey, console-y shooters are what you're after, I don't think you'll find better on the Amiga. What next? Well, how about Disposable Hero? One that a lot of people seem to remember fondly. Yes, it's a shmup that's very, very Euro in its design. A horizontal scroller with a lot of power-up options and a lot of very resilient enemies to pound your way through. Great looking? Well, it absolutely is. Maybe even better than Apidya. Lots of huge enemies and a fair amount of graphical skill on display. It's also great sounding too, the type of electronic throb that was starting to become very much the standard on Amiga games, but undeniably well done. Okay, we really should be taking this as read by now, but it is difficult. Very, very difficult. Of course it is, it's a shooter, they all are, but this especially so. A long, hard slog through some very enemy-dense levels reveals a slick but terrifying world, one where the bosses don't know when to give up, but do look very nice as they absorb a million bullets. The very Euro-style power-up shop is fun to mess around with, the most twiddly set of options you could ever expect in an otherwise entirely action-oriented game. The shops are placed often enough in the levels to give you a nice break from the action. You're not hurried through your choices, but having to go through all the rigmarole of the ship loadout in each of what will be many attempts does get a bit tedious. I have a feeling that hardcore shooter fans will take issue with some of this game's mechanics, and probably more casual players will find it a bit too inaccessible, but I'm sure this appeals to someone. It's too nice to be ignored, even if it's not for everyone. Okay, we're on the home straight now, a couple more games to talk about though, and one that I feel duty bound to include even if I'm not personally that enthusiastic about it. It's Project X. Created by Team 17 from Wakefield, would you believe? Is it great looking? Well, that seems to be a matter of opinion. It's definitely colourful and there's an awful lot happening on the screen, but, well, the art style, I can't escape the feeling that it is a touch amateurish. It's got a sort of public domain freeware air about it, betraying Team 17's origin in that field maybe, but some people seem to really, really love it. I try and maintain a certain amount of objectivity in these things, but, well, here, I just don't see it. Project X was hyped as a console-style shooter on its release, and it garnered a lot of good review scores, but the gameplay, like the visuals, is a bit insipid. The developers may have seen other shooters in action, maybe over someone's shoulder in Dixon's, but I'm not sure they actually played them, missing what made these games fun. Compared to actual console shooters like Phalanx on the Super NES, well, it's not all that thrilling. And let's not forget the voice samples. It probably seemed like a fantastic idea during development, but the novelty wears off after about 4 seconds. The continual weapons announcements and even the occasional game tips are both amazingly pointless and amazingly irritating.
Aliens require multiple hits.
It's like being stuck in an endless customer support menu. Where's the button that lets me talk to a live operator? Hello, Team 17? Yes, I'd like to make a complaint. I mean, who wants to hear someone from West Yorkshire talking over a game? It wouldn't be so bad, but I think the amount of voice clips is why this fairly short game is spread across 4 whole discs, loading time piling up with the rest of the woes. Why did I include this game, just to trash it? I know people will ask that. Well, it's so well known amongst Amiga fans that I just couldn't leave it alone, really. I know full well that some people really love this game, and it does have some redeeming qualities, and Team 17 of course would go on to great things later on, so let's just move swiftly on and visit the last in the line with Agony. Released by Psygnosis in 1992, an exemplar of their then house style, you'll find no argument from me that this looks absolutely stunning. Stunning for an Amiga game, stunning for any home platform in the early 90s. 3 separate layers of parallax scrolling, one of them animated, is this game's front and centre stunner, much remarked on at the time and still looking nice today. The Amiga OCS hardware had by default 2 separate playfields, allowing for some nice parallax effects, but here a clever technique turns that into 3. The reduced colour depth that's a side effect of this, well hidden by some copper chip raster effects. Laid on top of that is a whole load of clever stuff with sprites and glitter objects, including the rain effect on the opening level, creating a smoothly advancing living frieze bursting with depth and detail. All the levels are very, very nice to look at, done in a sort of digital fantasy pastoralist style that continues on from the Shadow of the Beast. The final touch is added by the static artworks between each level, in full 64 colour half-bright overscan mode if you care about the details, done like most of this game's graphics by Frank Sauer. Yep, it does look good. And the music, well, the music is impressive too. Maybe not always impressive in a good way, impressive as in it leaves an impression. I think the composer's brief may have included the word dramatic, probably underlined a few times. Perhaps the term bombastic came up too. You know that music that plays in Star Trek when Captain Kirk throws down with a rubber alien? Yeah, make it like that all the way through. The end result sounds something like it was composed by John Williams whilst falling down a flight of stairs. I wouldn't say it's completely charmless, far from it, but it does become a bit overwhelming at points. And yes, sadly, it's not the only thing about this game that starts to grate after a while. For all its in-your-face artistry, underneath it all it is a pretty standard by-the-numbers shooter, the audio-visual carnival not backed up with brilliance in game design. Especially the bosses, they seem to have been way down the list of priorities. Maybe they thought that fun end-of-level encounters would somehow ruin the artistic vision, leaving us with a load of listless run-ins with bosses who don't seem to be quite up to the job. Level 3's face-off with a roughly carved boxing trophy is a particular lowlight. It's like fighting Joe Bugner's car boot sale. But I don't want to get too carried away with its weaknesses. Whilst it's far from flawless, it's still very much a worthwhile experience. Its bizarrely ambitious artistry and technical flourishes overcome its rough spots and make sure it's something that's still worth a visit. I think now though it's time to slam on the brakes and call this a conclusion to the foregoing. I've managed to cram a lot in here, but there's still so much more I could have covered, but didn't. I've avoided anything but your straight up scrolling shooters, and yes, that's why I haven't featured the Chaos engine. I've also steered clear of anything requiring a more powerful Amiga to run. That will have to wait for another video, but the Amiga as a topic is something that I can't stay away from for long, so stay tuned for more in this vein. So farewell and adieu for now, till we meet again.